I also don't have slides, and I only have two comments, basically, and I feel a little out of place because my comments are more framework related. Okay, and maybe it's because I'm not familiar with ESCAP's style in terms of hitting the theme only in the third chapter. But when I see a title like this, right, I expected that a framework would be provided from the get-go, right? When you read it, it's like, okay, that's what we're going to talk about. And that the survey itself would be framed by that. However, I didn't find the framework in the beginning, and indeed the first two chapters of the survey, which were about macroeconomic projections, near-term economic performance and the future of our growth, there was no reference to climate change. I mean, there was not much. I really looked, so I think chapter 1, there were two mentions of climate change in chapter 1 in the context of debt, the debt challenge for small island developing states. And at the end of the chapter where it prescribed prudent and nimble policies to navigate, quote, growing macroeconomic uncertainties in the near term, among which were trade tensions and reconfiguration of global value chains, China, structural change, and it mentions the continuous threats of natural and climate shocks. But those continuing threats were not mentioned in chapter 1, not even as a major headwind or anything like that, or as a risk that could not be ignored. Then on chapter 2, when they were talking about the future of economic growth in the region, climate change was mentioned once. The chapter discussed international and technological landscape for future economic growth, and highlighted three issues, right? Elevated focus on national interest, concerns over the future modalities of production and division of labor, and an urgent, quote, an urgent green economic transformation in view of the mounting socio-economic threat of climate change. But the discussion was really about this green economic transformation and how it could have an adverse impact on the current account balance, external debt, if driven by imported technology. There was also a concern for a trade-off between environmental sustainability and economic growth when green production remains mostly cost uncompetitive in the absence of uniform global carbon pricing. So it's a very narrow insertion of climate, a mention of climate. And this is too bad because in chapter 2, box 2.1, it was about growth accounting and total factor productivity, where it explained, the factors of growth, inputs, capital, labor, production amplifiers. And that could have been a really good time to introduce and explain climate change and its potential impact on the macroeconomy, because it impacts those inputs, right? Labor, capital, production amplifiers. Clearly, that's the simple link. Then moving forward, then I noticed a constant, several times it was mentioned, so chapter 3 and onward, right, where they did start talking about the framework, but there was a qualifier. It seemed to be motivated by, and I'll quote it, coping with and addressing climate change are not traditional macroeconomic goals. That was repeated several times in the report. And I was kind of surprised. I disagree. Climate change is the context within which the real economy operates. We live in real space and time, and the economy is embedded in space and time. And certainly climate change is taking place. Thus, the pursuit of traditional macroeconomic goals, which I assume we all understand to be stabilization and growth, cannot take place, cannot take climate change, cannot ignore climate change, because it's the context, right? So it is certainly within the purview of traditional macroeconomic goals and traditional macroeconomic policymakers. They may not have, they may have been slow to recognize it as context, but it's not, it is within their purview. It should be within their purview. Okay, so that statement, and it was repeated. So it seemed like it was suggesting that climate change is an added task, right, to macroeconomic policymaking. It's like, no, we have to do our macroeconomic policymaking, stabilization and growth, recognizing that that surrounds us, climate change. It's not an add-on. Actually, the table, the original reference, there was a table in chapter 4, table 4.1. And I looked at it, and the original reference was Parker, 2023. It was something from the European Central Bank. And the original reference of table 4.1 could have been used to explain clearly how climate change impinges on stabilization and growth, which are our macroeconomic goals, right? And I make the distinction because table 4.1, the title of table 4.1 was examples of impact of climate change on the economy. But the original reference, the table in Parker, was the impact of climate change on the components of potential output. Okay, that's a very big difference. And an explanation of potential output could have anchored a discussion of stabilization policy and growth policy. And so the impact of and a discussion of the impact of climate change on its components would have anchored a discussion on climate change and macroeconomic goals and policies, right? So, potential output, as we know, and it could have been explained in a box, is the highest level of output. No, it's not in this slide. Is the highest level of output that an economy can sustain over the medium term. That's how we define it, right? And so when actual output diverges from potential output, there is an output gap. If the output gap is positive, right, there is an upward pressure on costs of factors of production, resulting in higher prices, inflation, etc. And so that means tighter monetary policy, right? If the output gap is negative, that tends to put downward pressure, right? And so potential output, it's not directly observable, but it's key in stabilization policy, right? Estimating it. And potential output is also something we look at when we talk about growth, because growth, we want to move potential output to the right? We want to expand potential output. So it's a very good device. And if you, Aya, can you show that table? I just picked up Parker's table, if you can, where it shows, well, it's very much like table 4.1 in the, no, it's the one I sent. Yeah. Okay, anyway, so you have, it shows the components of potential output, capital, labor, and productivity, right? And then the rows are about long-term impacts, sudden events and transitions. That's the one. Okay, so this is from Parker 2023, which was slightly adopted into the table 4.1 of the report. And if you look at that, it becomes very tangible how climate change can affect the macroeconomy, right? Because if it affects capital stock, labor supply, total productivity, it affects potential output, right? And if, depending on what happens on the, demand side, you would have to be what these things do to the demand side, it would inform stabilization policy. To expand potential output, you would have to address these things. So it becomes very tangible, right? So you can see labor, right? Capital and so forth. It's just a grounding, it's an anchoring of that, right? And so it also tells you, not all of these channels affect potential output in the medium term, as Parker explains. Slow-moving impacts of climate change can reduce potential output in the longer run, right? So if we don't do anything, that's what you're saying. If we don't do anything about adaptation, potential output shrinks, okay? And so that's not about stabilization policy, that's about growth policy, and things like that. So it could have been used in this way. So I do think that the survey, maybe could have used clearer devices. It's a good device in terms of explaining the macroeconomic implications of climate change, and perhaps also started off with it, since the first two chapters were about macroeconomics. So you can't tell us that we have to integrate it, but in the first two chapters it wasn't, right? Because then there's no demonstration how it should be done. By the way, I don't quite agree with the fact that we don't know the macroeconomic implications of climate change. I believe if we agree with theory, growth theory, etc., then we can easily hypothesize, right? What we don't know is an empirical matter. We haven't measured it, right? We haven't measured the marginal effects of this or whatever. And in fact, in the graph that was shown, I think slide 17 of the presentation, the one where the impact on global GDP, remember that thing? Okay. Where you say it may be insignificant or it could be significant, and there are many predictions. You found it? Okay, anyway, I just wanted to point out that's global average. The issue with climate, right, is that it is nonlinear and highly localized. So, no, it's sige, just go forward. There, stop, no, there you go, on the right? So yeah, you can see so many uncertain impacts on GDP. That's global, you know what I mean? And what does that tell you? It says it's not global that we have to look at, because we know it's happening, non-linear and local. And that's what we should see. And that's what we should be measuring, because then we can have more clear policy making. Okay, so just because we can't see it at the global level doesn't mean it cannot be measured at the local level. And therefore, we can know it more. Okay, so that's the framing. The second comment had to do with the index. So a new index is being proposed. The report mentions the Notre Dame index, the GAIN index, and several others. And then Notre Dame, of course, we know, measures both, attempts to assess countries' vulnerability versus their preparedness, right? Which is what they're also doing. The report says that existing methodologies, however, often fall short in their applicability to Asia-Pacific countries due to several limitations. For instance, they focus on aggregate impacts of climate change, GDP losses, and so it sort of critiques ND gain. Okay, I think ND gain is useful. I think it's useful, and I'm not sure what it means that it's not applicable to Asia-Pacific. I think it's applicable to all countries, right? It's a specific measure. What is being proposed is something else, okay? And I think someone has to explain how it differs. Okay, why? Because the ND gain, can you show the quadrants of the results of the index for the Philippines, where we're less, I think Sunny mentioned, right? Where it says that we're more ready and less exposed or something. As presented, oh nga, as presented by the new by this different index, right? So let me just wait for it. Sige. Okay, stop. So this index puts us in the green box. ND gain puts us at the direct opposite of this. We are in the red box in ND gain. Okay? In ND gain, we are highly exposed and with less coping ability. So my question is, how do we handle these two indices? And can and I think if a new index is being proposed, it's incumbent on that proposal to say what the value added is in terms of information, and also why it's different from things that have been being used before, so that we know what to do. I'm sorry, I didn't read that part really carefully, because I was just struck at the complete different, the result is completely different. So it says, okay, what does that mean? And which one is really pertinent to, I don't know, we have to assess it, right? I would not take this as gospel truth nor ND gain, right? This is something that you look at the background and find out what's going, but I'd like to know, based on the indicators used, why it's so different. Diba? I also have just to say that indices in general, parang, it's like a sausage, right? You can put so many things in there and you don't know what's moving it, right? So we also have to be, any index is like that, right? You can put as many as you want. And so you're not quite sure what it is. And so this is what I mean. I don't know why it's different. And I hope it can be explained. And so we can, get use the best out of each, right? But I think ND gain has actually been quite useful thus far. Okay. I think that's it. The only thing I wanted to the last thing I wanted to say had something to do with what John JP said, the strategic foresight thing. Okay, I'm not sure I'm not sure how that operationalizes. Okay, I do think, however, in my view, that for climate, I'm not sure the strategic foresight capacity should be invested at the national level. Okay, given that climate impacts are highly local and in our geography, right? I think any strategic capacity should be invested at the provincial level. And I think that that should apply differently to different countries, because for as long as we're at the national level where one size fits all, as we know, nothing's going to happen about climate change adaptation in this country, right? Even the indices, whether it's agriculture, you're talking land, sea, it's so different here, right? So I do think whatever we learn from this, we must apply judicious, with great thought into the country and not just take it as it is. Thank you.